Well, going for a walk this morning. Here we go, here we go. I do still walk with the walker because I want to concentrate on actually walking and not so much on having to balance myself. And there is my house and my new driveway. It looks so good, holy cow. I don't usually see it from out front. It's all painted up nicely. Let me turn you around here and you can see it. It's all painted up nicely. Look at that. Look at that. Landscaped. One of the topics that I talked about on my live stream this morning, which is a recurring theme for me, and I think one of the greatest traps that we fall into executing this carnivore lifestyle. One of the greatest traps is overcomplicating everything. We are told to manage our own health care. But we're not qualified doctors, certainly. We hesitate to think that we need professionals to tell us what to do. Now, on the other hand, you contrast that with the fact that I think the advice we're getting from the entire healthcare community on the proper diet, treating what we perceive as diseases rather than poisonings, are caused by the misinformation and brainwashing of the actual medical community itself. So what do we do? What do we do? We're not doctors. But in a lot of respects, they're not doctors either. They're not enlightened. They're brainwashed the same as we are. And here we sit in a system where we follow the advice that these people give us in our effort to be healthy. We get sick because of that advice. Then we go back to these same people who basically tell us it's our fault. We're not eating healthy foods. But doc, that's all I'm eating is the food you told me were healthy. I'm eating very little meat, no fat, no salt, mostly plant-based, healthy fruits and vegetables. Fruit, plenty of fruit. So, how is that my fault? Hey, you're not getting enough exercise. Doc, I go to the gym 3 hours a day and I'm still gaining weight. I've become a diabetic. My cholesterol is perfect according to you. I take my statins. How come I'm sick, doc? Well, it can't be anything that we're telling you to do. It must be something wrong with you, probably genetics. Yeah, but doc, my parents weren't ever sick. They weren't diabetics. They weren't fat. Nobody in my family ever was. Well, There's something idiopathically wrong with you. And that's their fallback. Idiopathic. That's a fictional disease that they came up with to explain everything they don't understand. It should be painfully obvious. It should be painfully obvious to anybody, that all of their advice is based on a false premise. A false assumption. Because most bad science has its complete and total basis in a false assumption, a false given. Some particular thing that's accepted as an undeniable truth in trying to figure out what's wrong. Well, it can't be that, because everybody knows that can't possibly be to blame. So it must be something else. That applies to all science. So now let's examine that methodology. The greatest example that we live with is diet recommendations. This false assumption in all dietary recommendations these days is about fat. It's about fat. And it goes like this. Why are we getting fat? Is it something we eat? Well, they say, you must be eating too much fat. Everybody knows that eating fat makes you fat. And it's accepted. So they recommend a low-fat diet. So you eat this low-fat diet, start eating this low-fat diet, and what do you replace the fat with? You don't replace it with meat, because everybody knows that red meat causes cancer and diabetes. Well, no, it doesn't, but everybody knows that because studies from both Harvard and Tufts universities have shown that eating red meat may cause an increased risk of heart disease. Again, it also may not, but everybody doesn't know that. And somehow it always boils down to, considering all these givens are facts, indisputable, undeniable, settled science, it has to be something else. This also showed up in Ancel Keys's work as something we call the French paradox. Wow, look how far I went. Something called the French paradox. Okay, what does that mean? Well, Ancel Keys did a study called the 7-country study. And they charted fat consumption against heart disease. And concluded when they put 7 countries on a chart that the more fat a society ate, the higher their rates of heart disease. And that resulted in what was called the diet heart hypothesis, where they equated heart disease with fat intake and was the start. Back in the 50s and 60s of the recommendations to eat a low-fat diet. That was called the diet-heart hypothesis. It was accepted then as fact because Ansel Keys' study proved that the more fat you eat, the more heart disease you get. They then looked at why do you get heart disease? Well, because cholesterol forms plaque in your arteries. Cholesterol must come from eating all that saturated fat that comes with meat, further reinforcing what everybody knows is that red meat, saturated fat, is ultimately responsible for heart disease. We still believe that. In the scientific medical community, as a settled science, undeniably true, proven. But when you look back at Ansel Keys' study, he didn't just study 7 countries. He studied 22 countries. Seven of them showed up in his study, and one would think that Ansel Keys was not interested in science, but interested in proving himself right and everybody else wrong, including all of his opponents who said that maybe it's not the fat that's causing all this heart disease, maybe it's sugar. People like John Yudkin in England. Well, Ansel Keys pretty well put a stop to the foolishness of John Yudkin. Tried every underhanded trick to discredit him because he was convinced he was right. He was convinced that he was right. There were some countries in this study where the numbers didn't jive. One of the most glaring of those was France. On the chart, the French ate the highest content of saturated fat in their diet. Everything the French ate was laced with fat. Cream sauces, plenty of meat. Even the baked goods and the treats and the sweets were loaded with butter, like a croissant that drips butter. And yet the French, of all the countries studied, heart disease was, for all intents and purposes, non-existent. Non-existent. How do you explain this? Logical minds want to know. How can this be true? After all, if you're going to make a claim that this causes that, that has to be universally true. And there were a number of these exceptions in the data that Ansel Keys chose to leave out of his 700 study. France being the most glaring. Well, again, inquiring minds wanted to know, what are the French? And they call that the French paradox. A whole country, the results of their health outcomes flew right in the face of what Ansel Keys swore was a causal relationship. Not just an association, but this causes that, requiring the highest level of clinical studies and proof. He made those claims. He made those claims, and they went about trying to explain the French paradox. So, here comes another one of those false assumptions. In explaining the French paradox, here's the way the logic went. Well, we know that eating saturated fat causes heart disease. That's a given. Well, that might have been Ansel Keys' given, but by the time people started to challenge his theories and used to throw up the French paradox, he had considered his findings settled science, and so did most of everybody else. The government had already embarked on a mission to create dietary guidelines to protect the health of the American people, whose health was deteriorating pretty fast, and they want to fix it. So to explain the French, these rocket scientists started with this false premise. Well, we know that saturated fat causes heart disease. Why don't the French get heart disease? And they went to work. Well, let's troubleshoot it. What are the French doing differently than most other people who are getting heart disease? And we've proven that with our 7-country study. And they thought, and they came up with a brilliant conclusion that because they drink red wine, honest, you can't make this up. They drink red wine. Must be something in the red wine that counteracts. Yeah, that's it. The wine, the polyphenols, the tannins that are in red wine counteract whatever the saturated fat is doing to cause heart disease. And that was their conclusion. And the wine industry took off because they started recommending, as a very healthy intervention for the effects of eating all of this evil saturated fat, that you drink at least a glass of red wine a day. And of course, the Wine Growers Association was overjoyed, and the propaganda started flying about how good it was for you. And that became a trend. And now we never see a housewife at home without a glass of wine in her hand. Because after all, I care about my health, and I'm going to do those things that make me healthy. And let me wrestle this in the house. Made it. Went a little further today. All right. That was enough, though. So, what did they do? They gave us advice that further exacerbated the problem by introducing alcohol and sugar as another mandatory daily intervention to keep us healthy, and made the problem worse. That's the trouble with false premises. And we'll stop it there today. But this is how it happened. So whenever somebody tells you something is settled science, it has to be true, studies show, trials prove, you have to look deep. Look at the data, look at the people who are sponsoring it and paying for it. Look for the fraud. Because I'm here to tell you, virtually any study, theory that associates red meat and saturated fat with any kind of disease, by definition and by what we carnivores have proven to ourselves over years, We know it's nonsense, propaganda. Most often starts with a false premise, beginning with the words, well, everybody knows. And that's how easily manipulated we become. Well, I did it. I'm still standing. Went for a nice little walk, talked a little bit. I'm going to sit down and relax now. You take the rest of the day off, and we'll see you the next time. Oh, and don't forget to eat meat.